Well, Bernie went back on the Joe Rogan Experience. It was great to see Bernie on Joe Rogan's show. He was recently on Andrew Schultz's show. We talked about that here, even though a lot of the media didn't pay attention at all to Bernie Sanders' wildly successful conversation with Andrew Schultz, where, again, I said this at the time, but I think he made the actual best pitch for democratic socialism, no pun intended, in their conversation about baseball, of all things, their conversation about baseball. And I say that as a fervent opponent of democratic socialism. So Bernie, I don't think, had quite as successful an outing on Joe Rogan's show as he did on Andrew Schultz's. I think Rogan is probably more in the Trump camp than Schultz is. But I just wanted to note a couple of things that I found quite interesting. On the right, predictably, what's going viral are these clips of Rogan, as people say, quote unquote, fact checking, as the people who are posting these clips say, fact checking Bernie Sanders. And as he talks about Trump and the media and all of that, and I think Rogan held his own in those conversations. There's a clip going viral of Bernie saying, I don't know, over and over again. That's a cheap shot. It's a good thing when politicians or journalists say they don't know. Whether you're Ted Cruz and you're not just making up a number of the population of Iran, or Bernie Sanders talking to Joe Rogan. Granted, some things politicians absolutely should know, but that's kind of a separate question than the question of being authentic and honest when you don't know the answer to a question. So I don't think that's really the most damning attack on Bernie Sanders, to be quite honest, although I do think for a leftist, like a genuine dyed-in-the-wool leftist like Bernie Sanders, there's probably more room for him over the last decade to have defended, bear with me, Donald Trump against, for example, the selective leaking of the intelligence community. The way that Trump talks about, or not Trump himself, but people in Trump world talk about the soft power abuses of USAID, for example. A lot of these are probably, pretty fertile ground for agreement. So anyway, what the right is pushing out are those clips of Bernie Sanders, and what Bernie Sanders himself pushed out were clips about him talking to Rogan, discussing Gaza, and discussing minimum wage. And I wanted to put this post up from Brianna Joy Gray, who said, I'm sort of impressed by Joe Rogan's grasp of corruption, corporate greed, etc., and his advocacy for a living wage, fewer restrictions on food stamps, etc., in his recent episode with Bernie Sanders. He comes back to these themes on his own without being directed by Bernie. If you're not familiar with Bree, she actually was the press secretary for Bernie's 2020 campaign. So an interesting comment from her, and Bernie going on Rogan became a total, ridiculous controversy for him when people said, this was back in the heyday of cancel culture, at its height, and I can't even believe in 2025 I'm looking back at that and talking about it as though it's a previous era. It's just insane. It felt like it would never end, but yeah, this was a major controversy at the time that that Bernie Sanders had gone on Joe Rogan, and it's one of the things, I don't know that Rogan's ever said this outwardly, but it's one of the things that pushed, in all likelihood, Rogan closer and closer to Donald Trump. This is a man who, when Tulsi Gabbard was a Bernie-supporting Democrat, talked to her. And this is a man who, as Brianna says here, has his grasp of corruption, corporate greed, and advocacy for a living wage, fewer restrictions on food stamps, etc. It's all to the very obvious point that Democrats don't need Joe Rogan. They just don't want a Joe Rogan who is friendly to Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders, because they don't want Zohran Mamdani, they don't want Bernie Sanders, they certainly didn't want Tulsi Gabbard. He's just the wrong kind of Democrat. They want some type of astroturfed. By the way, they don't even want David Hogg. They kicked David Hogg out of the DNC. It's a little bit more complicated than that. We talked about it in a previous episode. You can go ahead and watch, but they kicked David Hogg out of the DNC, and that's how their threshold That's how low their threshold is for what constitutes like tolerable criticism of the party. And the reason that Joe Rogan, Andrew Schultz, and the quote-unquote podcast bros are popular is because they criticize the Democratic Party. So you cannot have a bunch of Dem donors astroturf a podcaster because they're not going to want them talking to, for example, Bernie Sanders about Gaza and a living wage and fewer restrictions on food stamps. So they basically have to live here with Bernie Sanders or present a capable alternative. And that's been their biggest problem. And that is just underscored by what happened in New York this week. And this is the connection between Bernie and Rogan and Zohran Mamdani. Everyone has been saying on the left, like the left, listen, you guys want young men? Look, you have Zohran Mamdani right here. I don't know that that's totally correct, but it is correct that he's somebody that is resonating with a lot of young people. We still have to like put some of the numbers to the test, and Democratic primary isn't in New York City isn't a perfect proxy for what would happen nationwide, but it is an important one. He connected with a lot of young people. He's become a sort of sensation, and he ran a really, really smart campaign. But where I think this is interesting is that without the ridiculous ranked choice voting system in New York City, but particularly without Andrew Cuomo, you cannot come up with a more ridiculous Democratic candidate than Andrew Cuomo, except, wait, give me 1 second, Eric Adams. This is what the Democratic establishment in New York City has to offer. One of the most powerful, the center of global power, biggest city, one of the biggest cities in America. I forget if it's New York or LA. Either way, they put up Andrew Cuomo. They put up Eric Adams. Eric Adams is a complicated story, but basically we can just focus here on Andrew Cuomo. They let Andrew Cuomo take the establishment Democrat lane. It's the same thing they did with Joe Biden in 2024, and then foisted Kamala Harris. They let Joe Biden basically not run in a primary. Then they had no primary, mini primary, or Democratic process, and just reappointed, I shouldn't say reappointed, but just put Kamala Harris into that slot after Biden dropped out. It's the same thing that they did with Hillary Clinton when the DNC was basically trying to undermine the Sanders candidacy. They did that in 2016, they did it in 2020, and guess what's happening? It is making these Democratic establishment candidates utterly unpalatable to younger voters in particular, but voters in general. So you are asking people to choose between a Democratic socialist. Not everybody who voted for Zohran Mamdani wants Democratic socialism. But you know what they want less? Andrew freaking Cuomo. It's the same thing with Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump, Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. Joe Biden actually benefited from the contrast in 2020 and was able to eke out a win. When people are voting for lesser of two evils, yeah. What a pathetic choice. I'm sorry, but it's a pathetic choice. In 2016, you have to choose between a man who's, really never been in political office. Some people see that as an advantage, but just fresh off hosting Celebrity Apprentice, and Hillary Clinton, the mascot for Washington corruption and mismanagement. So the Democratic establishment is responsible for pushing people to political desperation. If they want to stop Zohran Mamdani, it's so easy. Don't run Andrew Cuomo. If you don't want to have to panic about a Democratic socialist winning, like straight from DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, winning the mayoral primary in New York City, then don't run Andrew Cuomo. Don't back Andrew Cuomo with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars. Don't do it. It's actually really easy to not send voters to the corner of Democratic socialism. You just have to tell the mascots of the failed party establishment, to sit this one out and find younger, better talent. By the way, that's also not insufferable. It's kind of a problem for Democrats because of the last, I'd say, decade of the culture war. A lot of and you see this with Pete Buttigieg, the changes in Pete Buttigieg as he has gone on his own podcast Odyssey. He's a slightly different person now when he talks about cultural issues, and he's got a beard. They're trying. But it's a problem for them. Their bench has been sort of forged in this very odd decade. That the left itself foisted on America. So they're in a hole, and they're trying to dig out of it. And, well, Bernie's giving them... It's never a bad thing when a prominent popular Democrat goes on Joe Biden. If Joe Biden comes with a podcast, you know that it's the apocalypse. Everything. The end of the world is imminent. But when a prominent... he caucuses with the Democrats. Bernie's technically an independent. But when a prominent lawmaker on the left goes on Joe Rogan, it's only a good thing because they're opening up the lines of conversation, and they're probably going to agree with him on a lot. So thank you for watching. Make sure if you want a premium version of the show, you can head over to undercurrents.tv. You get full versions of our interviews. So that's where to go, undercurrents.tv. Subscribe on YouTube, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And I'm headed to the Aspen Ideas Fest, so I hope to be grabbing some interviews with interesting people out there, and I will see you again soon.